Imagine a country so divided by language that its own government collapsed for 541 days. No prime minister, no functioning federal cabinet, just gridlock. And yet the streets stayed clean, the trains ran, and people went about their lives like nothing happened. That country is Belgium, a nation smaller than the state of Maryland, sandwiched between France, Germany, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. And somehow, it ended up with three official languages, two deeply divided cultural communities, and a capital city that is technically bilingual but feels like a battlefield. How does a country this small end up this complicated? That's exactly what we're unpacking today. To understand why Belgians speak different languages, you have to go back. Not 10 years, not 100 years. We're talking over 1,000 years back, all the way to the land itself. Picture a small piece of land sitting right in the middle of Western Europe. No mountains to protect it, no wide rivers to seal it off. Just open, flat, accessible land. The kind of land that every powerful empire and every ambitious army wants to march straight through. That is Belgium. And because of where it sits on the map, it has been fought over, ruled over, and divided more times than most countries 10 times its size. Now, here is where the language story begins. A very long time ago, two very different groups of people moved into this land from two very different directions. From the south came the Romans, and with them came Latin, the language of the Roman Empire. The Romans built roads, established cities, and ruled the southern part of this region for hundreds of years. Latin slowly mixed with local speech and eventually grew into what we now call French. From the north came Germanic tribes, most importantly, a group called the Franks. These were tough, determined people who pushed into the northern part of the region and simply stayed. They were not interested in speaking Latin. They kept their own language, which over time developed into Dutch. So you now have two groups of people living in the same small piece of land, speaking two completely different languages, and a natural invisible line forming between them. The South speaks one thing, the North speaks another. And this happened not because of any law or government decision, it happened simply because of who settled where and who influenced whom. Fast forward through the centuries, and those two groups became two distinct communities. The people in the north became known as the Flemish, and their region became known as Flanders. The people in the south became known as the Walloons, and their region became known as Wallonia. But wait, there is still one more group, tucked quietly into the far eastern corner of the country, right along the German border, lives a small community of around 78,000 people who speak German. Not French, not Dutch, German. And yes, that makes German the third official language of Belgium. So before Belgium was even a country, before anyone drew borders or wrote a constitution, the land had already been divided by language, by history, and by the very different peoples who called it home. Belgium was never one people from the beginning, and that single fact explains almost everything. Here is where the story gets really interesting and a little surprising. Because Belgium did not become a country the way most countries do, there was no ancient tribe that said, "This is our homeland." There was no great king who united his people under one flag. Belgium was not born. It was assembled, pieced together by circumstance, politics, and a whole lot of outside interference. For centuries, the region that is now Belgium was treated like a prize to be won. Powerful empires looked at this small, wealthy, well-positioned piece of land and said, "We want that." And so it was passed from one ruler to the next, like a piece of furniture at an auction. First, the Spanish controlled it. Then the Austrians took over. Then Napoleon Bonaparte and his French army swept through and added it to the French Empire. The people living there had very little say in any of this. They were simply handed from one master to the next. Then, in 1815, Napoleon was finally defeated. The great powers of Europe gathered together at a meeting called the Congress of Vienna. Think of it as the world's most important committee meeting, and they began redrawing the map of Europe. Their solution for Belgium? Merge it with the Netherlands. Just stick the two territories together and call it the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. Problem solved. Or so they thought. But there was a very big problem. The people in the north of this new combined kingdom were Dutch-speaking and Protestant. The people in the south, the Belgians, were French-speaking and Catholic. Different language, different religion, different culture, different economic interests. And one king, a Dutch king, who seemed far more interested in the north than the south. The southern Belgians grew angrier by the year. They felt ignored, talked over, and pushed around. And in 1830, that anger finally exploded. Revolutions were breaking out all across Europe, and the Belgians decided it was their turn. They rose up against Dutch rule, and within a remarkably short time, they declared themselves an independent nation, the Kingdom of Belgium. The major European powers recognized the new country, and just like that, Belgium was on the map. But here is the part that most people do not know, and it is important. The brand new Belgian state was deeply shaped by French culture. The ruling class spoke French. The courts operated in French. The army gave orders in French. The universities taught in French. French was the language of education, of money, of power, and of respect. And this created a painful reality for the Flemish people in the north. They were now citizens of Belgium, but French-speaking elites ran everything. A Flemish man could walk into a courtroom in his own country and not understand a single word being said. A Flemish mother could watch her child struggle in a school system that taught in a language they barely spoke at home. There is something you need to understand about human beings. You can take away a person's land. You can take away their money. But when you take away their language, the very words they use to think, to pray, to sing, to tell their children good night, you are taking away something far deeper. And eventually, they will fight to get it back. That is exactly what happened in Belgium. By the mid-1800s, the Flemish people had grown tired of being treated as lesser citizens in their own country. French was the language of power, and if you could not speak it fluently, doors were closed to you. Want to go to university? French. Want to work in government? French. Want to stand before a judge and defend yourself in court? French. For ordinary Flemish men and women who grew up speaking Dutch at home, this was not just inconvenient, it was humiliating, so they began to push back. Flemish writers started producing powerful literature in their own language, books, poems, and plays that said loudly and proudly, "Our language matters. Our culture matters. We matter." Intellectuals and activists took to the streets and to the parliament, demanding that Dutch be given the same respect as French. They wanted Flemish children taught in Dutch. They wanted courts in Flanders to hear cases in Dutch. They wanted to be treated not as second-class citizens, but as equals. The government listened slowly, grudgingly, and only a little at a time. A small law here, a tiny recognition there. Progress moved like cold honey, thick, slow, and deeply unsatisfying. French remained the dominant language of Belgian public life well into the 20th century. And then came World War I, and everything changed. In 1914, Germany invaded Belgium. The country was occupied. The people suffered terribly, and the Belgian army was thrown into one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history. But inside that horror, a deeply painful truth was exposed. The Belgian army gave all its commands in French, and the Flemish soldiers who made up an enormous portion of the fighting force could often not understand what their officers were saying. Think about that for a moment. Young Flemish men, scared and exhausted, standing in muddy trenches with bombs falling around them, receiving orders in a language they barely spoke. Some of them made fatal mistakes. Some of them simply did not know what to do. Men died not just because of enemy fire, but because of a language barrier that nobody in power had bothered to fix. That injustice burned itself into the soul of the Flemish community. An entire generation came home from the war not just traumatized, but furious. The Flemish movement, which had been simmering for decades, now caught fire. The demand for linguistic equality was no longer polite. It was urgent, it was angry, and this time Belgium had no choice but to listen. By the time the 1960s arrived, Belgium was sitting on a powder keg. Decades of tension between French speakers and Dutch speakers had built up like pressure inside a sealed bottle. Political arguments were going in circles. Communities were growing more resentful of each other by the year. The government could see that if something did not change and change soon, the whole country could crack apart. So Belgium did something that very few countries in the world have ever done. It picked up a pen and drew a line straight across itself. Not a wall, not a fence, just a line on a map, but that line would change everything. It was drawn in 1962 and 1963, and it is called the linguistic frontier, or simply the language border. Starting from the western coast, it cuts across the country from west to east, slicing Belgium cleanly into separate language zones. And from that moment forward, the rules were simple and strict. Everything north of the line, the region called Flanders, is officially Dutch-speaking. Full stop. Everything south of the line, the region called Wallonia, is officially French-speaking. Full stop. Out in the far eastern corner, near the German border, sits the small German-speaking community with their own official status. And right in the heart of the country, surrounded by Flemish territory on all sides, sits Brussels, the capital city, officially designated as bilingual, meaning both French and Dutch are recognized there. Now, you might be thinking, fine, that sounds like a reasonable solution. Draw a line. Everyone knows where they stand. Problem solved. But here's what that line actually means in real life. And this is where it gets personal. If you live just north of that border, your child goes to a Dutch language school. If you live just south of that same border, perhaps just one street away, your child goes to a French language school. When you walk into a government office, the language used depends entirely on which side of the line that office sits on. Road signs, official letters, court documents, hospital forms, all of it, determined not by what language you personally speak, but by where you happen to live on the map. Move to the wrong side of that line and the government will still communicate with you in the regional language, whether you understand it or not. And here is perhaps the most remarkable thing of all. That line has barely shifted one single inch since it was drawn over 60 years ago. In a world where borders change, where cities grow and societies evolve, Belgium's internal language border has remained almost completely frozen. Political scientists will tell you it is one of the most rigid internal borders anywhere in Europe, harder to cross culturally, in many ways, than the borders between entirely separate countries. Sometimes history plays a cruel trick. It takes everything you thought was permanent, everything that seemed solid and certain, and it flips it completely upside down. And nowhere is that more true than in the economic story of Belgium. Cast your mind back to the 1800s. Wallonia, the French-speaking south, was booming. Underneath its rolling hills sat some of the richest coal deposits in all of Europe. Its steel mills were roaring. Its factories were running day and night. Wallonia was not just the economic engine of Belgium, it was one of the most industrially powerful regions on the entire continent. French was not just the language of culture and government, it was the language of money, of success, of the future. Meanwhile, Flanders in the north was largely poor and rural. Flemish families worked the land. Opportunities were limited. Many young Flemish people left their villages looking for work, sometimes heading south to find jobs in the very Walloon factories that reinforced French as the dominant language of economic power. For a long time, the message was clear: if you want to succeed in Belgium, speak French. But then, the 20th century began to turn, and slowly, quietly, everything started to change. The great coal mines of Wallonia began to run dry. The steel industry, which had made the South so powerful, started to collapse under the weight of cheaper foreign competition. One by one, the factories fell silent. The furnaces went cold. Entire communities that had been built around industrial work suddenly found themselves without it. Unemployment rose. Investment dried up. Wallonia, once the proud powerhouse of Belgium, began to struggle. And while the South was declining, something remarkable was happening in the north. Flanders reinvented itself. The Flemish built modern ports, most notably the port of Antwerp, which grew into one of the busiest and most important ports in the entire world. They attracted international businesses and investment. They developed strong technology, chemical, and trade industries. They educated their people and built a dynamic, forward-looking economy. Today, Flanders is significantly wealthier than Wallonia, and the gap between them keeps growing. Now here is where the story takes yet another sharp turn. Belgium operates as one country, which means money is shared across regions through federal tax transfers. In simple terms, wealthier regions contribute more, and that money helps support struggling regions. And today, that means Flemish tax money flows south into Wallonia. The Flemish are deeply aware of this, and many of them are deeply unhappy about it. The feeling that has taken root in parts of Flanders is sharp and simple. Why should we keep paying for a region that speaks a different language and votes for different politicians? The language divide was always emotional. Now it has a price tag attached to it, and that has made it more explosive than ever. If Belgium is complicated, then Brussels is complicated squared. This is a city that seems to have been specifically designed to confuse everyone, a place where every rule has an exception and every answer leads to 3 more questions. In fact, to truly understand Brussels, you almost have to forget everything you have learned so far and start fresh. Let us begin with geography. Brussels sits physically inside Flanders. If you look at a map, the city is completely surrounded on all sides by Dutch-speaking Flemish territory. By all logic, Brussels should be a Dutch-speaking city. That is what the geography says. That is what the language border would suggest. But history did not get that memo. For most of its history, Brussels developed as a French-speaking city. The elite spoke French. The businesses operated in French. The social life, the culture, the restaurants, the theaters, all French. So by the time Belgium drew its famous language border in the 1960s, Brussels was an island of French speech, sitting in the middle of a Dutch-speaking sea. The solution the government landed on was to declare Brussels officially bilingual, both French and Dutch recognized, both languages protected, both communities acknowledged. On paper, it sounds perfectly fair and reasonable, but real life, as always, is messier than paper. In practice, Brussels today is overwhelmingly French-speaking. Walk into most shops, cafes, or offices in the city center, and French is what you will hear. Dutch exists officially on street signs, in government buildings, in schools, but it is very much the junior partner in daily life. And on top of all of this, Brussels has become one of the most international cities in all of Europe. Why? Because Brussels is the headquarters of the European Union and home to NATO. Tens of thousands of diplomats, officials, lawyers, lobbyists, and international workers have poured into the city from every corner of the world. Many of them speak neither French nor Dutch. Fluently, they speak English. So you now have a city that is officially bilingual in French and Dutch, predominantly French in practice, and increasingly international in reality. And the Flemish community is watching all of this with deep frustration. They see French-speaking Brussels slowly expanding outward, spilling into surrounding Flemish towns and villages as city residents move to the suburbs but bring their French language with them. The Flemish fear their towns are being quietly absorbed, their language pushed back street by street. The French speakers, on the other hand, accuse the Flemish of trying to isolate Brussels, of deliberately keeping the city small and cutting it off from the surrounding region out of political spite. Both sides feel threatened. Both sides feel wronged. And Brussels sits in the middle, messy, vibrant, international, and utterly unresolved. It is not just a city. It is a mirror reflecting every contradiction Belgium has never managed to fix. This is the question that hangs over Belgium like a permanent cloud. And what makes it so striking is that it is not just foreign journalists or outside observers asking it. Belgians themselves ask it at dinner tables, in newspapers, in parliament, and in universities. Can this country actually hold together? And honestly, nobody has a confident answer. To understand just how fragile the situation has become, you need to know what Belgium has been doing to keep itself in one piece. Since the 1970s, Belgium has rewritten its own constitution multiple times. Each reform has done the same thing, taken power away from the central federal government and handed it down to the regions and communities. Flanders now controls its own education, its own culture, its own economic policy. Wallonia does the same. Even the small German-speaking community has its own government and its own parliament. Brussels has its own separate set of institutions, on top of everything else. The result is a system so layered, so complex, and so tangled that political scientists around the world use Belgium as a classroom example, a living case study of what a country looks like when it is held together not by unity, but by an extraordinarily complicated set of compromises. Some call it a marvel of political engineering, others call it a house of cards. And every time Belgium holds a federal election, the whole fragile structure is tested again. Forming a government in Belgium is not just difficult, it is legendary. After each election, politicians from different language groups and different parties must somehow agree on a coalition that can govern the entire country. This process regularly takes months. Sometimes it takes much longer than that. Belgium once went 541 days without a functioning federal government, setting a world record. And then, years later, came dangerously close to breaking that record all over again. 541 days. No government, and yet the streets stayed clean. The hospitals kept running. The trains kept moving. Life continued almost as normal. And that tells you something deeply important about Belgium. Because for all its arguments, for all its division, for all the political parties that openly campaign for Flemish independence and a full split of the country, Belgium refuses to die. Its economy keeps functioning. Brussels keeps growing. Belgians keep making some of the finest chocolate, the crispiest waffles, and the most extraordinary range of beers in the world. And they get on with their lives with a kind of stubborn, quiet determination. Belgium is a country that should not work, and yet somehow, impossibly, stubbornly, almost defiantly, it does. Why do Belgians speak different languages? Because Belgium was never really one people to begin with. It was a political project, a country assembled from history, geography, war, and compromise that brought together communities who had been developing separately for over 1,000 years. The language divide isn't a bug in Belgium's story. It is Belgium's story. And in a world where countries are increasingly defined by what divides them, Belgium's messy, complicated, dysfunctional, and somehow still standing experiment might be the most honest country on earth. If you found this interesting, comment, hit the like button, and subscribe, because next week we're diving into another country with an identity crisis that makes Belgium look simple.